Good morning, everyone. My name is Steven Zarnfaller, and I'm the Director of Communications at the Fedcap Group. And it's truly an honor to be here today to welcome you to our 18th Solution Series. For nearly a decade, we've been holding these discussions on topics that are critically important to business. The expertise of the panelists over the years have added much to our collective thinking and problem solving. We are grateful to our distinguished panelists today, who will be introduced in a moment by Lori, for sharing your experience and lessons learned with us. We're really eager to hear what you have to say today. During these sessions, we've explored topics that go to the heart of the environment in which we operate. Some of them include the cost-benefit of increasing minimum wage, the impact of immigration on business, how to maximize organizational intelligence, tapping into the talent of the 55-plus generation, and mental health and substance abuse, and many other topics. Today's conversation is on organizational structure and is an equally important conversation, one especially relevant to us at the Fedcap Group. Increasingly, leaders across the world are seeing how smart, well-designed organizational culture can enhance a company's overall performance. Research also tells us that failure to recognize the importance of organizational structure is a contributor to companies' lack of sustainability. So bottom line, structure does matter. We have many guests in the room today, including our friends from Oracle, Salesforce, USI, Ocean Janitorial, Alpha Business Solutions, Car Xerox, Hub International, an array of many New York City government agencies, including HRA, Department of Admin Services, Department of Cultural Affairs, academia, including representatives from CUNY and St. John's University, and many other strong partners, including Urban Resource Institute. Thank you so much for joining us. We want to also recognize our board members in the room, Mark O'Donoghue, our board chair, as well as numerous other board members whose contributions of time and talent make what we do possible. Finally, we'd like to extend a special note of gratitude to our sponsors, Mutual of America, for the use of this wonderful space and this amazing breakfast. We are so very grateful for your partnership. And so without further comments, I would like to introduce Lori Lutz, our Chief Strategy Officer and my manager, who will moderate the panel. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen, and good morning, everyone. We love seeing this room as packed as it is today, and I think you're in for a treat. I have thoroughly enjoyed my time in preparing for this panel with these three remarkable panelists. Our first panelist I would like to introduce you to is Mario Desideiro. Mario is the Managing Director of Enterprise Solutions and Analytics for Huron Consulting. And I do need my glasses. If you spend any time Googling, you'll find that Mario is a recognized industry thought leader on analytics and business intelligence. He has more than 20 years of experience in the implementation of strategic business and technological solutions, actually across the world. I think that you will find that Mario's comments are smart and thoughtful, and you'll love his approach to this topic. So join me in welcoming Mario. I also want to introduce Dianne Morales, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Phipps Neighborhood. She's got quite a pedigree. I'll list some of the items that I think are most important. She spent more than 20 years in program startup, and think about the impact of and the relationship between structure and startup, including the implementation of the New York City Department of Education Office of Youth Development and School Community Services. I don't know who named that office.
Not me.
The launching of the Teaching Commission and the development of the early childhood nonprofit Jumpstart. Dianne has been recognized by the New York City Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, Hispanic Lifestyle, and the Latino Social Work Task Force. I think you'll find in this panel that Dianne's insightful and intentional way of thinking about structure will generate lots of ideas. And certainly, last but not least, is Mike Sicard. And Mike is the CEO of USI Services. And Mike joined USI in 2007. And for the past 12 years, Mike has been the driver behind significant growth and success, more than tripling its size. He launched some very innovative structural elements to USI, USI One Advantage, which is a robust set of risk management and benefit solution tools. And he also started USI Gives Back, which is an innovative nationwide community service program. Mike's intelligent and forward-thinking approach to this topic will lend, I think, again, new ideas in how we structure. So let's begin. And thank you. Let's welcome the whole panel, if we could. So organizational structure is defined as a pattern of actions and interactions that are undertaken by organizational members to advance the goals of an organization. For many, many years, probably over 100 years, organizational structure was kind of a staid concept. It was a lot of boxes, and those boxes were aligned within departments or divisions. And there wasn't a lot of concepts or a lot of discussion about how those boxes interacted. Over the past decade, organizational structure has really evolved into a tool, a leverageable tool for advancing organizational goals. And so I'd like to start out by asking Mike, can you provide an overview of how you think about organizational structure and why it matters to USI and to you as a leader?
Sure, happy to. First, thanks to everybody for taking the time. I know how hard it is to find time during the day. What I found to be true for us is that there isn't a single structure that works in all cases, and that for me and for us, structure follows strategy. If you figure out what you want to do and then figure out what structure to enable that, that seemed more effective than actually choosing a structure. We had a head of HR when I joined USI 12 years ago, and on my second day I met with him, and he said, "What's the right structure for our firm?" And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Well, it depends on what we want to do. If we want to do this, then it's a different structure. If we want to do this, it's a different structure." And I said, "What do you think?" And he said, No, here's the right structure." And so we parted. I made a structural change in removing that person and getting a new person. And so what we did is we had a challenge where we had birthed our company through basically a series of individual acquisitions over a long period of time. And we had these kind of feudal kingdoms that existed across the organization. And nobody really talked to each other. Nobody really knew each other that well. And so what we thought our effective strategy was if we could pull that together and actually pull the power of the combined knowledge together, which is easy to say and at least for us hard to do. So we tried to figure out a structure that would actually enable that. And so the first thing that we did was we actually reduced the distance by bringing physically people together. So instead of actually them being an outpost, we physically brought them together in sessions. Two, we stripped hierarchy. We said hierarchy be damned. Like when you're in these sessions, there's no CEO and chief whatever, and so everybody is equal in the conversation. In fact, the most interesting ideas tend to come from the least senior people in the organization. They come from the people who are closest to the problem. And then three, when we got together, we gave ourselves real problems to work on. So instead of speakers just throwing up PowerPoint slides or going blah, 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 we actually put a real problem in the table, rolled up our sleeves, and then actually went and did something. And the result of that was actually breaking down literally the barriers from our organization, bringing people together, and they started to create a shared culture. And so I asked somebody some years ago to draw what they thought the organizational structure was for USI, because typically it's boxes, right? It's somebody and then these two people and then they tell two friends and they tell two friends and you get the kind of the box tree. And somebody drew a chocolate chip cookie. Basically, it was a circle with dots in the middle. And they said, "I think this is our organizational structure." We're all in there, right? But nobody quite knows exactly, who's sort of secondary, or we're all kind of working as a shared partnership. And for us, that was a great example of actually breaking down these siloed boundaries into a shared structure. So for us, structure following strategy and doing that by pulling that group together in a non-hierarchical way unleashed for us the power of the silos.
I think, Mike, in our discussions, you said that one of the things you had to break down, if I can use your language, was feudal kingdoms, and that all these offices out there had individuals who really did do their own thing in their own way. How did you break through that?
Our organizational idea was more of a partnership, kind of like instead of a corporate hierarchy where there is a boss followed by, because people I have found to be quite protective of their turf, their knowledge, and they use it as a basis of power, right? Like the more that I know something that you don't know, the more necessary I am to the world, right? And so I don't want to really share that stuff because I'm giving away the secret sauce. And so what we did is we created also a platform where it was kind of a giant corporate company-wide take a penny, leave a penny. And so basically it was a knowledge platform where if you gave into it, you also drew from it. And instead of a penny, it became really valuable stuff, things that actually were really powerful ideas. And so we created incentives for people to contribute into that so that, and they were kind of getting as good as they were giving as well. So that helped us.
Thank you. For those who attended our solution series on maximizing organizational intelligence, that may ring familiar because that was really a lot of the driver behind really having an intelligent organization. And so Mario, what are some of your driving thoughts about structure?
Yeah, so probably a lot of it has to do with just growing up as an athlete and being kind of part of team environments. And to your point, the hierarchies don't really exist in when you talk about team environments. So the idea of understanding your strengths, understanding your weaknesses, playing to your strengths, but augmenting your weaknesses. So within our organization, we've created a concept what we call two in the box, where you cannot be an expert at everything. And then if you try to do everything, you're also going to fail at everything, right? So understand your strengths, get other individuals to complement your weaknesses, and then really be a team as we go to market moving forward. So that permeates throughout the organization, and not only within the individuals we have in our organization, but also if you look at our extended partner network. You mentioned Oracle and Salesforce being in the audience there. We have the same concept with our partners where we're partnering with other organizations and we're going to market with our strengths, their strengths, and really elevating what we do in the market. A perfect example is just from an organization structure. We don't have a hierarchy. We've got what we call our market leaders who really know the area that they cover, whether it be an industry or geographic focus. Their focus is really around understanding the local community, the industries in their local community, and then we also have our national solution leaders. And their job is really to be the expert at whatever that solution is. It's the combination of those two individuals complementing each other's skills is what really delivers excellence in the market for us. And it's been a concept where we've been able to bring together teams, because what we do is very team-oriented, and we're assembling team on a global basis. So it's not uncommon for us to, every time we get a new project, have to bring together a new team and quickly gel that team together. And by understanding everybody's strengths, understanding people's weaknesses, we can get a team that complements each other. So from an organizational structure standpoint, I like the cookie analogy, because if somebody had to draw our organization structure, it's so team-oriented, it's very project-oriented, and it would be this pool of resources that come together to ultimately have a common vision and a common goal to solve. So
when you're devising this team structure, is the identification of strengths and gaps transparent? How do you go about that process? Yeah, I think people are very transparent. Transparency is kind of pervasive within our organization. You know each other's strengths, right? And the nice thing about understanding strengths and some of the weaknesses there, you're not going to get somebody to really be passionate about something that they don't enjoy doing. That's not their kind of normal thought process, right? So I think we very much make that part of our culture. And part of bringing those two individuals together, those two complements together, is that you also provide some mentoring in that process too. So it has not only an added value to the way we go to market, but also has added value as far as career development goes as you start pairing those things out. And one last follow-up question to that. What Mario is describing must sound a little bit like operationalizing the cube for the folks that are from the Fedcap Group and others in the organization that know of that concept, Salesforce and others. Has it been challenging to incentivize the market leaders and the solution leaders to work as a team? Has that been challenging?
So if you'd asked me that, 4 years ago, we were brought together in 4 startup organizations, everybody very entrepreneurial. Huron bought those organizations, my organization being one of them. There were a lot of egos involved. But what ended up happening is that we decided to make sure that we throw away everybody's culture, everybody's organization structure, and decide on what we were going to be, as Huron, with a common vision, common reward, incentives. And then the first year, everybody was like, yeah, that all sounds good on paper, but at the end of the year, we backed it up and made sure that the financial incentives were aligned. And there were people that ultimately opted out, and that was okay, right? Because if you're going to be on the team, you know your role, you know our vision, and if that wasn't for you, we weren't going to change what our strategy was. So you ultimately had to start with strategy. And after consistent behavior, everybody's like, wow, we're serious about this. And now, everybody speaks that same common vision, that same kind of strategy. And if anything, as people come into the organization, they're like, yeah, no, this is real. You have to live by it, and they will reward you based on it. Now, if you decide to go off kilter, you're going to get brought back into your lane there.
Thanks, Mario, so much. And Dianne, how have you thought about structure, especially in all of those startups, but in any way you want to describe it? How do you think about structure?
Sure. So first I'll say it's great to be on this panel. I feel a little bit like an outlier because my market, the market that I have addressed throughout the course of my career, has essentially been vulnerable populations, right? So we're in the business of people, like literally. And I have, particularly over the last 15 years, where I've not been in startup organizations, I have been in inherited organizations that were doing just fine, right? That were kind of okay to sort of continue business as usual. And I have slightly different standards than that. And so coming into these organizations, I think one of the things that I had to emphasize was the need to level up the performance. And in doing that, I think part of that involves a cultural shift, right? Because organizations that have been in existence for 45 years or 47 years and, this is the way we do things, creating organizational change, cultural change can be difficult. Often, one of the tools that I have used, to the point about strategy, right? If the strategy is ultimately to do things differently to get better outcomes, I've often restructured the organization in ways to support that different direction and that different vision. Sometimes that means that we need to create cross-functional teams, right? Rather than the traditional boxes of this is the education department, this is the career department, this is the benefits department. Really shaking things up and getting people to work in ways that they haven't been accustomed to, right? Because the reality of it is that in the human services sector specifically, things work better if you can address the whole person, right? Rather than, what are your needs in terms of healthcare, what are your needs in terms of education, and where the person is running around. So we've reoriented to a human-centered organizational structure that has created cross-functional teams to enable that kind of support, which has in turn pushed people to operate and perform differently, right? So that's where some of the cultural change comes in, because they start to think about themselves and their roles in a different, broader way, and they're thinking about their roles in relation to the desired long-term outcome or strategy. Right. The other thing that's happening is that we've brought teams together in different ways, right? So whereas normally you would go and you would meet with your team, now suddenly you're meeting with somebody else's team, right? And there's a different amount of cross-fertilization happening there in terms of idea sharing and innovation and sort of pushing and challenging. So those are some of the things that we've done, that I've done historically in terms of structure.
I think one of the things that you mentioned when we talked about, which I really liked, is from an external perspective, thinking about the fact that structure is often designed to influence how the external world sees you, as well as what you want to accomplish internally. You had an interesting reality when you joined Phipps in terms of the centers that were around the city.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about how you shifted that a little bit?
Yeah, it was a little bit of a nightmare. So we had, when I started, we had about 23 different locations. And there was, if you went to 2 or 3 of those locations or experienced them, there was nothing to indicate to you that there was a connection between them. There was no commonalities. Each location took on the personality, the culture of the leader at that site. And so if that leader was focused on, I'm kind of making this up, on the arts, then that's the experience that you had at that particular site. If that leader was focused on sports, that's the experience that you had at that site. Now, fundamentally, there's nothing wrong with that from a substance perspective. However, if there aren't shared goals, shared standards, a certain amount of shared sort of values, then what are we doing, right, as an organization? And so we had to actually come together and break that down in a way that enabled each of those sites to adopt shared values, shared goals, shared outcomes. And they could, where they had the freedom and the creativity for innovation was the sort of delivery of that. But the messaging around what we were doing, why we were doing it, and sort of what we were trying to accomplish, we went through a process, a 2-year process actually, of creating shared visions around those things, because it's important in terms of who we are as an organization that we're all working towards the same goal and rowing in the same direction, essentially.
Thanks so much. So Mario, building on what Dianne just said, I've heard Dianne emphasize the importance of leveraging structure to advance or change a culture. How have you used organizational structure to shift a culture?
Yeah, so what they say about culture, it's what people do when you're not looking, right? So from that perspective, transparency is kind of a hallmark of how we want to operate and how we do operate. Part of that transparency goes back to the 2 in the box, is that when it comes to our organization, our employees, we really want to have a mentality and a culture of owning your own future. Okay, that's been a big theme for our organization. The more valuable you are, the more you feel like you have control of owning your future, obviously the more engaged you're going to be. And engagement is ultimately what you really desire for all your folks within your organization. We've got individuals, I think, in 48 states and internationally too. So for us, having culture as that backbone that brings everybody together, unfortunately, we don't have everybody in a single location or a handful of locations. We're scattered. We're a technology firm. We have to leverage technology to create what we think it needs to be a smaller world, not a larger world, right? So how do we bring people together? And culture is ultimately the way to do that, as well as owning your own future. So part of that is giving the organizational structure, but also the tools, the technology, so people can feel enabled. We have a mentoring program where everybody in the organization has a mentor. 2 in a box, right? When we start talking about mentoring, it's really up to that mentor to provide guidance, as well as we create an organizational structure that has, for a lot of our projects, a quality assurance group where if you're having challenges, whether it's project-oriented, technology-oriented, that you can go to our quality assurance group and ask questions without fear of replication, right? And by having those organizational structures support what we're trying to really engage with transparency, with owning your own future, giving people the vehicle to not only say this is not just something on a wall, we're actually supporting it with financial parts of the organization and structure within the organization, really allows us to practice what we preach when it's all said and done. So that culture of not only having those words there, but also backing it up with organizational structure to give people the assurance that we're serious about it has really changed the way we work within the organization.
Thanks, Mario. This idea of every single individual having a mentor, structurally, can I just ask, how do you do that? How do you assign folks? How does that process work in a couple of sentences?
Yeah, listen, it's not perfect, and everybody will have a mentor, and maybe after 6 months, you're like, yeah, my mentor isn't quite ready for me, or I'm not really. And then the other thing, and I was told this early in my career, it's like, as a mentor, you're probably going to learn everything from me in the first 12 to 18 months, and I probably have nothing else to mentor you about. So we encourage people to move around a lot, to get different perspectives. So from that, the mentoring process at first was, the mentors felt like they had to be the ones being proactive. Well, that doesn't necessarily work. You have to flip the equation where the mentee has to be proactive. And that took a little while for people to understand that. And it goes back to owning your own future. People aren't just going to open up their arms and help you. You have to meet them in the middle. So both parties need to make sure that they're held accountable. And then at the end of the year, our mentors and mentees have scorecards, and we measure the effectiveness of that too. So it becomes, again, something that we're very proactive in, and it's not a program that just says, hey, we hope it works. We measure it on the back end to make sure it is working too.
Thanks, Mario.
Yeah.
So in all of our reading and research around this topic, and I hope you enjoy our briefing book that's in your packets, one of the things that we found is increasingly structure is being used to advance innovation. So let's address that and find out, Mike, just about everyone wants more creativity and innovation, but what's the secret to getting it? And interestingly, according to research by the Wharton School, while most companies agree innovation is vital, few actually spend time creating a structure or making some sort of a reward system hinged on creativity. So if you can talk about the challenge and the secret in creating a structure that advances innovation, that would be great.
Yeah, for us, I think sometimes creativity, I think, seems counterintuitive. Like the more boundaryless and the more free you are, then the more creative the environment will be. And I actually think it can be the opposite, which is sort of like I was watching a thing on a science channel one time, and there's energy in atoms, in all of the atoms, but they don't get unleashed unless you actually focus and bring those atoms together in some way, and that's how kind of nuclear energy is actually. So actually bringing the people together in a more structured environment actually frees creativity. So like the exercise is, if I said to all of us here, what's the one thing you would do to change the world? It's a really hard question. Your brain tends to lock up on something that's that significant. But if I narrow the question and I said, hey, what's one thing that would make your commute less stressful in the morning? Your brain zeroes in pretty quickly, and you suddenly start multiplying the ideas. Well, I could do this, I could do this, I could do this. And so what we did was actually bring, you kind of narrow to explode. You sort of, structure in order to actually create breakthroughs. So we created diverse groups of people that we brought together: diversity in geography, diversity in role, diversity in their background, age, all forms of diversity, but with a common understanding of a thing, whether it's a service that you provide or a product that you provide or an area of focus, and then narrowed the question for that group. So instead of just, hey, what's working and what should we do better, a very specific, hey, the most important service that we provide, what are 2 things that we could do to actually improve that service? Or the worst thing that we do, right? The worst service or product that we provide, what's the one thing we could do to improve that, or do we kill it, right? And when we narrowed that question, the brainstorming that happened, I think, dramatically was significant. We also had to, I think, set an expectation for what brainstorming and building on each other's ideas is, that I don't think there's a lot of good examples of, because a lot of people, I think, get their, at least in our experience, a lot of people got their experience by watching, sort of TV and what things are on TV. And whether this isn't a political statement, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, whether you're watching Fox News or MSNBC, and whether you think all of those are fair and balanced, none of them probably are. But what seems to happen, depressingly, is a common approach, which is moderator comes in and introduces a topic. Shouting head number 1 screams something. Shouting head number 2 screams the other thing, right? They argue and debate each other, and then the moderator says who won. And it's actually not supposed to work like that. Like the way it's supposed to work, my son and I, we went to go make a Mother's Day gift for my wife, and we made her, it was intended to be pottery. What came out is indecipherable. And I don't know what it's used for, actually. It's some combination of, I don't know. But it includes both of us, because actually, you know, like I put some things in and he put some things in, and then I put some things in and he put some things in. And it's pretty clear when you see it that it's actually a collaborative combination of what we both did. And the idea is to build, not to debate. So you don't go into that session arguing and defending your position. Like if you go into a brainstorming session with an idea that I'm going to bring an idea in, and success is if I come out and that idea is unscathed and won, then you're doing it wrong. If in fact you go in and you say, okay, you're going to add a piece of clay to that, right? And then Diane's going to add a component to that, and then Mario's going to add a component to that, and then what comes out looks different than what any of us individually put in. And if you prize that, and if you make that explicit, then we started to get that kind of adding participation. And so we did a little trick, which is, you know, verbally, you're not allowed to use the word but, you have to use the word and, right? Because but is, I heard what you just said, but here's why you're an idiot, and why what I'm about to say is much better than what you just said. And instead, you have to say and not just verbally, but mentally. Like when you're listening to what the other person is saying, you have to take that in and say, and what I would add to what Diane just said is, instead of but, what I would disagree with. And so we used that little bit mental and emotional trick, and it started working for us.
You also institutionalized that great innovation sessions with something called a collective knowledge platform. How do you institutionalize the ideas?
So what seems to happen is if you, I don't know if you've ever been to a session where there were good idea exchanges and they were thrown around verbally. And the problem with, I think, most of us is we retain things, if it's verbal, about as long as, like I have a 10-year-old son and he plays with soapy bubbles. About as long as those soapy bubbles last, that's about as long as we retain something, unless it's captured, right? So if it's just a nice verbal conversation, we say, that was a nice verbal conversation. We're pretty sure that 6 to 12 months, if we come do it again, we're gonna have the same darn conversation and go through the same stuff. So what we did is we said, we're only gonna think once. And so when you think capture, think capture, think capture. And so we codified and captured it and put it in a repository, put it in a place where basically people could start to access it. And then the goal and the destination became actually adding more to this thing. We used a little term inside of our company for what this thing became, and then we made it more interactive as well, so it was easier to use. It wasn't just a passive library, but it was actually kind of like a Google concept where there was lots of stuff in there, and we made it. We added a little knowledge portal so that you could actually ask questions effectively, and up would pop the answers. So it became highly valuable. As well.
That's great. Thank you so much. Diane, how have you, building on what Mike just said, talk about structure and innovation, and you've got some interesting experiences, so thank you around this.
Yeah, so one of the things that Phipps Neighborhood sort of prides itself on in terms of specialization is workforce development. Career development is actually what we call it. We've moved away from the model of just placing people in jobs and moved towards the model of helping to train and prepare people for careers, right? The idea of long-term career growth opportunities and economic pathways. And so probably about 6 years ago, shortly after arriving at the organization, one of the things we realized was that the Bronx has the highest statistics in terms of unemployment rates. Definitely citywide, statewide, and in many instances, nationwide. And there's a lot of organizations that do workforce development. And so, you know, it sort of didn't make sense to me. In particular, there was a disproportionately high unemployment number among young adults, the 18 to 28-year-old population. And so we wanted to do something different. The largest employer in the Bronx is actually Montefiore Medical Center. And at the time, they were doing what I would consider like the Pac-Man game. They were eating up all of the smaller local hospitals and clinics, and so they were growing. And I thought to myself, they have this need, and in their mission statement, they talk about helping to focus on the social determinants of health in the communities in which they're located. Perfect, right? Because they should be hiring people from the community. But there's a disconnect because the people from the community don't necessarily have the skill sets that they need in the hospital. Montefiore Medical Center had an average of 1,500 vacancies a day. when I approach them. Now, those vacancies range from the entry-level nutritionist to the head of the Department of Surgery, right? So there was quite a range. But at 1,500, you would imagine that quite a few of them would be positions that people from the community could be eligible for. So we approached them. I approached them boldly, straight to the president and said, you have a need, you have a mission, tell me what you need, I'll build it. And much to my surprise, he said yes. And so then we had to build it. We worked together, actually, because I needed the hospital to tell us more about what they were looking for, what the skill sets looked like, what the interpersonal skills looked like, and we started to build that together, right? Which was very different. My staff, who were used to sort of doing things a certain way, were kind of like, what are we doing? And then, actually, we decided that we wanted to do more than just put young people on this set healthcare career trajectory. We said, what if we actually provided them with options that included higher education, access to higher education, and mimicked middle-class families, right? Middle-class families start talking to their kids from the age of 4 about careers, right? You don't talk to your kids about you're going to be a mechanic or you're going to be in healthcare. You talk to them about their careers and you talk to them about those options and you help them understand how to access and tap into those options. So we brought Hostos Community College, which is the local community college, to the table as well. And to the point that Mike was making earlier, the question that we posed to the team was, what can you do to support this population? What does that look like? And together, the 3 partners actually developed this model that provides basic entry-level training, experience in a healthcare setting, and enough understanding of the academic credentials and degrees to follow the career ladder, that young people at the end of their participation in the program get to choose. And that partnership has actually resulted in, so we've been at it for about 6 years, and the partnership has actually resulted in retention rates for young people who do pursue careers in the healthcare setting, which is about 80%, retention rates that exceed the national average. So we're now at the point where we're starting to calculate the ROI for the hospital, the return on investment for the hospital, based on what used to be their recidivism rates, right? So they had a lot of attrition. For the entry-level roles, and the program has actually made a significant difference in that for the hospital. And now we're actually looking at how to replicate it in Westchester, and how to replicate it with high school students. Great. So it was that partnership, though, that I think sort of burst through everybody's preconceived notions of what to do and how to do it.
And the thing that I loved about that example is that it isn't just a one-off. This structurally institutionalizing this kind of community partnership is, I think, what maybe is the secret sauce in some ways for the organization. Mario, you had such interesting things to say about innovation and the need for Huron to reinvent itself every 2 years. When you said that and we were talking, I wrote it down and was struck by that concept. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, so the question I think I'd pose to the audience, something to think about, is that if 3 years from now, 100% of your revenue was come through a totally different channel, what you were doing 3 years ago no longer existed. And we're in technology, so things move very quickly. A lot of our clients are the ones disrupting organizations, disrupting the industries all in the valley. One of the things that we realized that 3 years ago, we were being disrupted, and there's this thing called the cloud, right? So it's out there, what's happening in the cloud. All the work that we were doing was what we called on-premise work. So we had to literally shift our on-premise work that we're doing in consulting, and that dried up to, I think it may be 2% of our revenue now, and go from the cloud being 0% of our revenue 4 years ago to 98% of our revenue now. Granted, still technology, but it's a different way of thinking about it. It's a different way of providing services. It's a different way of engaging your customer, and it's a quite more advanced way of bringing low-cost technology to the masses. Okay, so we had to reinvent ourselves. Well, we went through that reinvention, and we thought, wow, there's got to be a service here, right? So here's an opportunity. So we scoured the industry, and Clay Christensen, who he coined the term disruptive innovation, Harvard professor, had an organization called Insight that specifically focused on that, right? They've got a methodology called Future Back. We bought them 18 months ago because not only did we want to disrupt ourselves continuously, we also felt there was a need in the market to do that. So we every 2 years go through our own Future Back process, and the whole premise of that is what happens 3 years from now if 100% of your revenue is gone? Would you survive? So we're reinventing ourselves every 3 years with that underlying premise. Hopefully our 100% of our revenue won't be gone, but if history tells us anything in technology, it's going to be very different 3 years from now than what it is today. So that is just embedded culture, and it's about innovation. It's about staying really leading edge. And for our organization, there's both personal and financial incentives to make sure that we stay that way. It's interesting about the whole strategy and how many folks go away for a weekend. You lock yourselves in a room and you think, okay, I've got my strategy for the next 5 years, and we're off to it. Well, one of the things that we learned is that it's not a weekend event. You need to iterate through this thing, right? And as we go through our own disruption, we do that every single quarter. And what was a really good idea 3 months ago, 3 months later is like, wow, what were we thinking? So that constant disruption, the constant challenge, the constant understanding how the world around us is challenging or changing really challenged us to disrupt ourselves every 2 years.
Thank you, Mario. I found that fascinating, this concept of Future Back. Yeah. So we're going to shift just a little bit. Mike, for many leaders, and you each in your own way talked about that, it's like the first thing you do is restructuring 101. Somebody comes in and they restructure. But research tells us that 50% of these restructuring fail to accomplish the goals they were intended to accomplish. So why? What do you think is going on there?
A personal view is that you can restructure lots of moving boxes on a piece of paper, and you can do announcements where Mary's now in charge of X and Ted's now in charge of Y, and I think the rest of the organization doesn't care. I think they largely see that as rearranging deck chairs in the Titanic, and they think kind of just assume blah, blah, blah. And so trying to figure out a way to actually get everybody in the organization personally connected to whatever the heck you're trying to do, and then the restructuring be evident as to why we're doing it for them, I think is the key. Like we'll do an acquisition of an agency, and I'll go out and I'll do what I think is incredibly eloquent discussion of the industry and where things are headed and disruption and what we're doing and then open to questions. And the question is, how many vacation days am I going to have? And like nobody cares, right? Nobody cares about the broad, highfalutin kind of stuff. And so the question is how to tie it to what matters to them personally. And so we started a conversation which was pretty simple, which was, what matters to you personally in the group. And some people throw in what the business schools say, like, I want the company to do well. I want the organizational mission, right? And then you say, yeah, blah, blah, blah. You don't really care about that. What do you really, really care about? And then somebody pipes up and says, my family, right? The most important thing to me is me and my family and my kids and my partner and my spouse and my grandkids. And then the question is, all right, so who finds it helpful to have a job to achieve that? And every hand goes up. And who finds it helpful to have that job be paid? And every hand goes up. And who would like more? Who would like more salary? Who would like more benefits? Who would like more bonus? And every hand goes up. And so again, the question is, well, how does what we do here connect to that part of what you want? And very simply, there's a pool, there's a bucket of stuff, right, that we have to be able to fund all of that. And if you want more, that means that bucket has to go get bigger. There's only one healthy way for that bucket to get bigger, which is the top line of the organization, whatever you conceive of revenues to be, whether it's revenues, client revenues, donations, contributions, whatever it is, that top line has to move up. And if that moves up, that pool gets bigger to be able to fund more. If that top line goes down, that pool shrinks. And when that pool shrinks for people, that means that there's less to give people. And so making a simple connection to what this place does and how that connects to what you want. And then what could you do to help move that needle? And when you do the math typically on that, it's not a world beater thing. Like it's not asking somebody to do an 18-minute mile down to a 4-minute mile. It tends to be like 1 or 2 more whatevers, right? 1 or 2 more clients, 1 or 2 more services, 1 or 2 more things would actually make the organizational difference between negative and positive, or bad to really good. And so making that, I think, connection to what is viscerally most important to them. And then lastly, I think making a shared connection to what this place does, whatever the place is, that's more than just a paycheck as well. So like we do insurance in the clearest way, it's the most boring thing in the entire world. And it's the best way to clear a party, right? Which is say, hey, I sell insurance, and everybody takes off. And so, nobody voluntarily finds their way into it. And so the question is, but is that what we really do? And what I've become a believer of is actually we don't do that. What we actually do is we help people pursue whatever their hopes and dreams are. And the risks associated with that, if they don't get that right, they could bankrupt, they could not exist. And on a health side, we work with their employees to literally be here and be healthy for themselves and their families. My father died very suddenly when I was very little. And what's most sad about that for my mom was that it was preventable, that if he had actually taken care of himself, he would still be here for her and for our family. And so connecting to that kind of a mission, and then almost simultaneously knowing that the things that you're doing, if you do one more of those things, that would actually make the difference between you being able to have longevity, support, increase, and all of those things. If we can make those 2 things clear, then explain how we change the organizational structure, and Larry's now in charge of this, and Fred's now in charge of that, suddenly starts to make sense as to why, as opposed to make it about the leadership or the structure, because I don't think anybody really cares about that stuff unless they can see how it affects them personally.
Thanks, Mike. That's just poignant. Mario, in prep for this, I read an interesting article that says staff can experience cognitive dissonance if, in fact, the structure and incentives are not aligned with the culture. And as a result of the kind of failures that I mentioned that Mike was talking about, do you agree with that? And then how do you think the dissonance manifests itself, and how do you circle around it?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with that, and I talked about it earlier. We've got individuals geographically very dispersed, so our goal is to try to make the world smaller, and obviously not make it larger. From a common goal perspective, if you don't have that strategy, if you don't understand the underlying mission of what we're trying to accomplish, and it doesn't really resonate on a personal basis, people are going to look elsewhere. It's not just about the bottom line per se. Everybody absolutely expects to be paid well, to be employed, have some security from their financial as well as their family behavior, but they also have to be engaged, and understanding that on a one-on-one basis becomes very important. So for us, we're in the technology business. We're actually trying to leverage technology to make the world smaller, and understanding how we can personalize the experience for our folks instead of just thinking a one-size-fits-all, because one size does not fit all. And because of that, we're starting to see our engagement scores, and again, we measure everything. The introduction, I'm an analytics person, so we tend to measure everything, and things like Net Promoter Scores. And it's an ability to get feedback. And listen, we're not going to get everything right, but when we do understand that we're veering off course, we want to course correct it as soon as possible. So from that, it's absolutely critical that we begin to personalize the experiences for our individuals. And to your point, not make it about the organization, because you're right. I mean, it's all great that we deal with disruptive technology and all these great things we do for our clients, but unless you can personalize it, everybody's just kind of tuning this out and thinking, okay, what am I going to do over the weekend? What am I going to do with my family? And how do I basically have new and interesting experiences moving forward?
Thanks, Mario. So this concept of personalizing it, making it real for the employee is really a takeaway. That's both of you really share that. Dianne, When you think of the drivers of restructuring and what they should be, you had a great example of maybe a great driver and not such a successful implementation of that restructure.
Thanks, yeah.
Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I get to share my failures. The first thing I'll say is a lot of times new leaders come into organizations and create structural change just because it's sort of a way of asserting themselves, right? I'm here now, so this is the way I'm going to structure things and do things. I'm not a believer in that. I really think that there are definitely more subtle ways of asserting leadership than to come in and sort of do a whole reorg. That being said, there was a point where I was running an organization that served about 11,000 of some of New York City's most vulnerable youth. And these young people needed everything. They'd been failed by multiple systems, the education system, the child welfare system, the juvenile justice system, and they were coming to us for services. And we wanted to really create this very comprehensive process to serve them, and created this department that had a little bit of everything, right? Mental health services, education services, career services, all of it. And the first year, we also increased the number of young people we were serving from about 100 to 700. Really big change, both in terms of the number of young people we were serving, but also in terms of the organizational structure. I have to say that I admitted to Lori, it was a disaster. It just was, if you looked at the organizational chart, I mean, it wasn't a chocolate chip cookie, it was like a mashed chocolate chip cookie. There was no clarity around lines, around accountability, around partnership, and it just was this sort of jumbled mess. So we saw the outcomes go down in our second year. And had to sort of face the reality that this sort of big idea, this big concept of how we wanted to have the young people at the center and everybody sort of organizing our services around that young person actually needed more structure. It needed to be narrowed more to sort of continue on the theme that we've been talking about, right? We needed to actually shift how we were structured to create a process that would allow us to function in a much better way. And eventually we did that. The program is still thriving, I will say that. But it was quite a lesson learned at that point in time because, again, as I mentioned earlier, we're in the business of serving people. And when you don't meet the outcomes, you're failing people. And so that was a really, really challenging time in my career. Thank you so much for letting me share that.
But I think the thing I loved about that, not only was it a teachable moment for me and probably for all of us, but I think, as you said, Diane, it ties together the idea that sometimes we have to get small to get big. Sometimes we really have to zero in before we can explode. And I think that's an important lesson in this concept of structure. So I'd like each of you, if you could, just to provide one brief takeaway around structure that you might share with the audience, something that you think is really important to be able to do tomorrow. And I want to emphasize that I want to thank both, or all three, Mike, Diane, and Mario. Each of them emphasized the importance of this panel providing takeaways, providing something that you could immediately do so that it wasn't theoretical in nature, but it was really actionable. So, Mike.
I think one misstep that I've seen done in organizations is a structure serving the leadership team as opposed to the other way around. That, in my view, I work for our clients and I work for our team members. And everything I should do in the structure should be asking myself the question, what am I doing to make their job easier for the benefit of our clients' lives? And if I'm not asking and answering that question, and if I'm not meeting that standard, then I'm not doing my job. I think a lot of organizational structures are done for the benefit of the efficiency of the leadership, right? Makes it easier to get the finances, or makes it easier to, I don't have as many direct reports, so I don't have as hard a time. And it shouldn't be the organizational structure. I don't think should be there to serve the king, right, or the queen. It should be the opposite, right? You should work for the clients and the people that are serving the clients, and that's what the organizational structure should be set up to do. Even if it's harder on you, the chocolate chip cookie or the mashed chocolate chip cookie is inherently harder. What's easier is the military organization, right, where the general followed by. It's very efficient. It's easy to follow. It just doesn't usually unlock the right kind of combination of teamwork and unleash the sort of entrepreneurialism and the creativity. So what you tend to get in those organizational structures, or you can get in those organizational structures, is sort of automatons, where they, if I want your opinion, I'll give it to you, and you don't get the best out of folks, and you don't get their connection. So it's, I think, a messier organizational structure can actually be a better way to serve your ultimate clients and your people. So don't do it for leadership efficiency. I think it's the wrong reason.
Thanks, Mike. Mario.
Yeah, so it probably tagged along a little bit with Mike was saying there, is that, do you have a plan that if you were disrupted, what would the organization do? And do you have a culture that embraces that? You talk about the entrepreneurial culture, making sure that folks are always challenging themselves. Make that personal. And try to get that personal culture where you're listening to the folks and they've got vested interest, and it's a personalized vested interest. It's not just all about the bottom line, but it's also what they're going to get out of the equation. And the more efficient you can be around that, the more you can embrace it, the more you can create the culture. Culture will kind of self-govern the organization, but stay steadfast as to what that is. And then don't deviate from it, because the first day you deviate from it will be, well, it's just all lip service. So stay steadfast to it.
Thanks, Mario. Yeah. And Dianne, to finish us off today, you had a interesting piece of the puzzle, and I know it's a lot to say in a brief time, but I love this concept. So go for it.
So I've developed my own form of what I call talent management. I know it means a lot of different things to a lot of people, but to me what it means is when I identify talent outside the organization, I find a way to bring it in. Regardless of my organizational structure, it's one of those things where it's kind of counterintuitive. But if I find talent, I'm going to bring it into the organization and figure out the rest later. If I can convince that person to join the team, right? So my focus is really around trying to find people who I think can bring value to the organization, to the mission, to the strategy, to the people that we serve. And capture them as quickly as possible and work things out later. And so that goes a little bit counter to the structure piece, but I also think that speaks to the need for us to be flexible, no matter what the structure is and no matter how it's working, in order to continue to improve and continue to learn and continue to grow. So that's my own personal talent management strategy.
I love that. So, I am going to ask our Chief Information Officer to come up and close us out today. The panelists have graciously agreed to be available for questions afterwards, because there's often only one or two people that can ask questions. So they've agreed to stay for just a little bit after this and respond to your questions. And so can you join me in thanking them for a fascinating discussion? And Tammy.
Good morning, everyone. What a great conversation. I want to take time to thank the panelists for their compelling discussion. Mike, Mario, and Dianne, your insights and, experiences have really brought a balance to our conversation. I want to thank Lori for another great job. She always makes it seem so easy standing up here, and believe me, it's not. And I want to thank the engagement team for their hard work in pulling off a wonderful event. It takes a lot of work and planning and preparation. And I understand that we're being streamed via Facebook with over 400 followers. So thanks everyone so much for joining us, and have a great day.